Let's see. Last week was Pentecost. The Holy Spirit came down onto the disciples. Today we're going to talk about the Holy Spirit a little bit too. Because today I want to talk to you about the Great Commission. When after Easter, after the resurrection, Jesus came and spoke to the disciples and gave them his last commandments. Today we're in the book of Matthew chapter 28, verses 16 through 20. I want to set the scene just a little bit. This will be the first time since Jesus was arrested that the disciples will see him. Easter has come and gone. You can imagine what the disciples' lives have been like. They've been on the lam, they've been running, scared. Life hasn't been that great. And then Mary and Martha come to them and tell them that the tomb is empty and that they're to go and meet Jesus in Galilee. So we find them having made that journey. Verse 16 starts, "Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age.'" So here Jesus is talking to the disciples, giving them this commandment to go out to the nations, the Goy, as they would say in Hebrew, the Gentiles, which is you and me. And so we've kind of now, 2,000 years later, come full circle, haven't we? And now we sit in the place of the disciples, receiving through the book of Matthew this same commandment. Now we tend to focus on the part about going out and making disciples, but there's a lot more to the commandment than that, isn't there? There's also that part about obeying. And as someone who has 5-year-old twins, I can tell you that might be the hardest part, getting them to obey. My parents might say the same thing. But I think it's important for us to find ourselves in kind of the same place as the disciples, to look at the disciples where they were when they received this commandment and how they received it, because I think it speaks a lot to how we receive this commandment. How we receive this commandment. Did y'all catch that little addition there in verse 17? When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Now that word "some" there in the Greek can also be translated as just simply "they." So a translation that's just as good might be, "When they saw him, they worshiped him, and they doubted." So all of a sudden, we've got this juxtaposition, two things going on at the same time. The disciples have been traveling for a long time. Have any of y'all been traveling yet this summer? Have any of you gone on your summer vacation to the mountains or the beach or wherever? After about 12 hours in the car with some kids, can two things be happening at the same time? Can you be happy to arrive and ready to tear your hair out? All at the same time. And this is actually part of Matthew's theology, is part of his greater theology, that when we deal with God, when we're in relationship with God, it's not just a one-way thing. It's not just worship, worship, worship all the time. This is an amazing, amazing vacation Bible school set. And the kids will come and have all kinds of fun, but someday they'll have to learn that God also encompasses the bad times, the hard times, the doubtful times. It would be strange, to say the least, if the disciples could watch Jesus be arrested, hear of his, in the book of Matthew, hear of his, possibly witness from on far, his crucifixion, then hear of his resurrection and go there and see him and not have some kind of doubt, some kind of juxtaposition of feelings going on. And then to hear the commandments, they must have felt some doubt as well. I know I would be asking the question, can I do this? Can I accomplish this? I'm just a fisher from Galilee. I'm just, I'm just a nobody from nowhere. How could the disciples have seen that 2,000 years later, across an ocean, across cultures, across time and everything else, we'd be sitting here today hearing these commandments? And now that we're hearing them, we have to figure out how we are going to live them out. Fortunately for us, the story doesn't stop here. Luke continues the story of the disciples into the book of Acts. And in the book of Acts, we see some incredible heroics, some incredible people rise high above the normal person, what the normal person. We see Stephen become the first martyr. We see Saul become Paul. But I have to be honest with you, I'm personally not that interested, at least for today, in the heroes. Rather, I'm interested in the everyday relationship with God, the everyday disciple, the everyday obeyer of the commandments. Because I think that's where we're most likely to fall, isn't it? Tomorrow I will wake up, put on my shoes and go to my office, and no one will show up to throw stones at me. And yet I will have the opportunity to interact with dozens, if not hundreds of people, and each interaction will be an opportunity to either be the light of Christ or to diminish the light of Christ. Kind of a heavy thing when you think about it, isn't it? So how do we live out this commandment in our everyday lives? How do we take those baby steps of discipleship, which are the steps that led us to here and now? I think one of the things we have to understand is that Matthew is writing for a Jewish audience that understood they understood the Torah and the law very well. For Matthew, his goal in writing this gospel is to send it out to the synagogues all over Rome and to convert Jews themselves, who will then go out and convert the Gentiles. And so one of the things I have to think about when I think about how do we live this out is a prophecy that comes from the book of Jeremiah. And it speaks to how Matthew understood Jesus Christ. And the prophecy goes like this. This is the covenant. This is Jeremiah 31:33, if anybody wants to look it up later. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. And this speaks directly to how Jesus Christ understood the law, doesn't it? Because Jesus takes the great big Torah, the great big books of law, and he condenses them down. He condenses them down first in the Ten Commandments and then into the Golden Rule. Now, as he condenses them down, he doesn't get rid of anything. And yet, he makes it so that we can carry God's commandments with us wherever we go. Because I was thinking about the Great Commission, where it says, "And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth have been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you." And I was thinking about, how do we learn? How did I learn? How am I hopefully teaching my kids? How many of you had kids, or maybe a niece or a nephew or something like that, and you said a bad word around them? And all of a sudden, they knew that word and wouldn't let it go. It's the example, isn't it? The reality is that we primarily teach by example. We primarily teach by example. I think that's a fair statement. When we talk about Jesus being a rabbi and the 12 being his disciples, the idea behind being the disciple of a rabbi is you would follow him around so closely that you would learn from his example to do exactly what he did. You would learn to walk the way he walked, talk the way he talked, until you embodied that rabbi by learning from his example. So how can we go out into the world? How can we go out into the world, into our daily lives, and disciple people? I think it's by embodying this prophecy from Jeremiah. Because I think this prophecy becomes true through Jesus. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. We see it happen in the early Christian community in Acts. As I was reading through those first books of Acts, it's about the first 15, to see just what the disciples did and how they treat each other. For the most part, it's a beautiful, beautiful lesson in communal living and selling your property and giving it to the needy and in doing right by one another. But there was a story that stood out. How many of you remember the story of Ananias and Sapphira? It's a little sad. Sometimes I wonder if Ananias and Sapphira really deserved what they got, but for those of you who don't remember, let me remind you. This is from Acts chapter 5. But a man named Ananias, with the consent of his wife Sapphira, that's important, sold a piece of property. And with his wife's knowledge, he kept back some of the proceeds and brought only a part and laid it at the apostles' feet. As an aside, you see the context. Prior to this, whenever there was a need, the members of the first Acts community, that first church, would sell their property and give it to the church, and then it would go to the widows or the orphans or whoever needed it. So we have Ananias and Sapphira selling a piece of property and bringing in the proceeds and saying, here's the whole thing. Full proceeds. They want to get the recognition. They want everybody to think that they are truly upstanding citizens. Starting at verse 3, chapter 5. Ananias, Peter asked, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and to keep back part of the proceeds of the land while it remained unsold? Did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, were not the proceeds at your disposal? How is it that you have contrived this deed in your heart? You did not lie to us, but to God. That's important. Now, when Ananias heard these words, he fell down and died. Great fear seized all who heard it. The young men came and wrapped up his body, carried him out and buried him. And a few hours later, his wife, Sapphira, will show up and she'll do the same thing. She'll say to Peter, we sold this whole property. Here's all the money. And she will fall down and die as well. Now, I don't know that that's really a fair punishment, but I think the point is to hit home just what happens when we don't let the Holy Spirit guide us. Just how quickly it can poison a community, it can poison a family, just how quickly a few lies can make a big difference in our lives. I think we've all been there. I think we've all either had somebody tell us something that wasn't true, or maybe we've said something that wasn't true, and it's impacted a relationship, perhaps even killed a relationship. If you look back at this story, you'll notice that nowhere in it does it mention where Ananias and Sapphira went to the Holy Spirit, went to Jesus, went to the Father, the Son, and asked, what should we do? And Peter is very clear. It was their property. It was their money. They could do with it whatever they wanted. But the sin was in lying to God. Because I was thinking about how do we live out our faith in a way that it will become an example to others? How do we live out our faith in a way that the fact that God has put His law on our minds and in our hearts make a difference in our lives? And the only conclusion I could come to is that we've got to, and this is the most evil word that was ever invented, so I'm sorry I've got to say it, practice. We've got to practice. You know, there's that book by, I think his name's Malcolm Gladwell, where he says if you do something for 10,000 hours, you'll become an expert at it. That sounds true enough to me. If you look at the great athletes, you know, if you look at the people who are great at things, typically it turns out that they weren't just born with any of those skills. They had to practice, practice, practice. Every morning, or every night before I go to bed, I tell myself that I'm going to wake up early enough to spend 15 minutes reading a little bit of the Bible and praying. Now, because I got God, I have to be honest and say, I don't always do it. And my wife would probably tell you the truth too. But that's my goal. That's my practice. Every morning I try to wake up, spend a little bit of time in conversation with God so that when I need to make a decision, when I need to do something that has some kind of import, I'll be prepared, I'll be practiced, I'll already be involved in a conversation with God. Now, I don't know that everybody needs to wake up early in the morning to do that. I know lots of people who like to do it when they're jogging. I know lots of people who don't jog, so they like to do it in the shower. I know lots of... My challenge, this is my challenge to you today, is to practice being in relationship with God. Is to practice every day, to find a way to practice talking to God so that when a small decision comes up, when it's something that doesn't seem like it's a big deal comes up, you'll talk to God about it. And then you'll make a good decision. Because let's be perfectly honest. If we were reading the story of Ananias and Sapphira from the book of Acts, and they hadn't dropped dead, it probably really wouldn't seem like that big of a deal. After all, they're giving probably a lot of the proceeds to the church to go to the widows and the orphans and anyone else who needs it. They're just holding a little back. It's just a little white lie. So we've got to practice. We've got to practice looking at our heart. God says, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts, which is a big deal unless we ignore our hearts and our minds where God has put that law. Again, we're looking at the Great Commission, and I'm asking myself, how do we live out the Great Commission? And I think we do it day in and day out through our relationships with other people. And I think that the way that we get to a great relationship with other people is by having a great relationship with God. And I think the way we get to having a great relationship with God is by talking to Him even when we don't want to, even when we've got some doubt. How many husbands and wives would have a great relationship if they only talked when they were happy with each other? How many sons and fathers, daughters and mothers, daughters and sons would have a great relationship if they only talked to each other when they were happy with each other, when they didn't doubt? That's why I want to get back to verse 17. I think it's so important. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Even though they doubted, and this just gets to the heart of who Matthew is, even though they doubted, they still engaged in worship. They still engaged in relationship. And they didn't go off making any poor, crazy, wild decisions until a little bit later, but you'll have to read further in Acts for all that. God is relational. He truly is. Today, churches across the nation are celebrating what's called Trinity Sunday, when we talk about the fact that God is the Father, and He's the Son, and He's the Holy Spirit. So we have the Father to pray to, we have the Son to walk alongside us, and we have the Holy Spirit to enter our hearts and guide us. But how many of us wish we had listened to a little bit of guidance when we were younger? I know sometimes I do. It's easy to ignore the guidance that's given if you don't already have that relationship. So again, my challenge to you, and I'm going to get done a little early, so my charge as well. That's the price. This is going to be the price for getting done a little early. Figure out this week, if you don't already do it, how you can spend time in relationship with God, talking to Him, asking Him what you should be doing. Figure out what works for you. Don't try to do something that works for somebody else. Figure out what works for you. And then practice that every day until you've done it for at least 10,000 hours. And if you can actually keep track of that, then good job. Would you join me in prayer?